Teresa Degenhardt is a lecturer at in criminology at Queen's University Belfast. She has previously worked on the intersection between criminology and international relations, in particular on the intersection between military violence and crime and criminal justice, and on European border technologies from a critical perspective. Indeed, we were due to have Teresa as part of the series last semester, I think in March, to talk about some of that previous work, but unfortunately, due to the strike action that we've just been talking about, the presentation had to be cancelled. I'm therefore very excited that we've been able to rectify that by having her come today to discuss an exciting new project focused on immigration detention in Northern Ireland. Teresa has published in peer-reviewed academic journals such as Criminology and Criminal Justice, Punishment in Society, and Theoretical and Philosophical Criminology, as well as various chapters in edited collections on war and criminology. She can now also add presenting at the highly esteemed Crime, Justice and Seminar series to that impressive list of accolades. I'll now pass over to Teresa, who'll have approximately 45 minutes to present, and then we'll move on to the Q&A for the remainder of the session, which will take us broadly to the 2 p.m. mark, although I appreciate that some of you may have teaching commitments and will have to duck away before that time. Teresa, over to you.
Thank you, Grant, and thank you everyone here who has taken the time to listen to me today. I'm really delighted to be part of this seminar series, and I thank Andy and Grant for the persistence. I love the work that comes out from Edinburgh University, so I really look forward to the comments that might come out of this. This research that I'm going to present today is a new project for me because I've been working, as Grant has said, on different issues so far. So I look forward to comments because I hope to publish this as a book chapter in the proximate future. If you were to think about comments, not necessarily today, immediately after the talk, but let's say later on, or for those of you who might be watching this online, please feel free to contact me by email because your comment will certainly improve my work. So this research, as I said, started not that long ago, and it draws from the work of others who have been working for much longer on immigration detention. As populist movements are politically mobilized against migrants and are reclaiming state sovereignty, there is intense political attention on the practices of containment of migration. Katia Franco suggests that the crimigrant other constitutes the border of society, by which issues of citizenship are translated into privileges that afford mobilities. The law, in particular, disguises the ways in which issues of privilege, which are linked to one's passport or one's place of birth, are translated into moral issues of being inherently good or bad, as in alignment with the nation or not. The northern states, as Franco highlights, turn social exclusion based on inequality into questions of illegality. This moral worthiness is also what appeals to populist movements, as it positions them as inherently good in a context of new forms of deprivation and scarce resources. Bordering practices have mostly been conceptualized in criminology as new manifestation of penal power beyond the state. Border penalty is directed against another that is seen as dangerous and is thus criminalized so that the state can still claim its ability to control the population at a time in which its ability to do so is increasingly being challenged. The populist move against migrants is not just to produce the migrant as another to the citizen. It is useful to imagine the nation in moral terms as inherently good and thus distinguished from the inherently bad nature of the migrant on the basis of their cultural otherness. Katia Franco and Mary Bosworth have highlighted the role of geopolitics in the management of this form of penalty. As Katia Franco remarks, the process of crimigration, the process by which penal power and criminal law in particular are used to banish, to expel some migrants from the community, are tightly linked to processes of construction of an us and them. So I've placed my research on those bases on Northern Ireland, because I find this a key new strategic geopolitical position as a result of the Brexit referendum. And I want to look at who is in detention in this context, with the assumption that those who are in detentions are the result of specific processes of selection, as according to critical criminologists. I also look at this during the time of COVID-19, and I look at it as a syndemic rather than a pandemic, because I take this to be, as Horton, the editor of The Lancet, said, a disease that did not pursue its own logics, but compounded other lines of inequality and difference, such as race, gender, ethnicity, and class. I look at this time in particular because looking at an exceptional time, I reveal the strategic focus of the system. It is well rehearsed that penal practices in general and migrant detention practices in particular change character according to different settings and different cultural embeddedness. How are processes of bordering manifested in this area and translated into detention for those who are selected by criminalization processes? The border in Ireland is still invisible in its particular way, by which it remains a border for those who sees it as important, but invisible for those who sees it as a sign of the UK presence on the island of Ireland. The Brexit referendum, though, involves some sign of separation between the UK and the EU, the UK and Ireland, Northern Ireland and the EU. And I wonder what kind of practices would this new geopolitical landscape involve? So as I said, Northern Ireland, which you can see there in the island of Ireland, you're probably familiar with it, however, is a particularly intriguing context in which to look at these processes, as it is a state situated in the island of Ireland, technically still in the European Union, yet it belongs formally to the Constitution of the United Kingdom, a country that has just left the EU under populist pressure. Northern Ireland thus represents a new neighboring country of the EU, the so-called Fortress Europe, but it is a country that is still placed in an affluent or northern context, even if at the periphery, though technically it belongs also to the colonized nations for its historical background. So if usually the Fortress Europe has some power with which they can have global South country perform the border for them in externalization of practices that are often illegal or violating international law, I wonder what kind of practices are in place in this different context. Northern Ireland is also a contested state in which what is usually conceived as a nation is not univocal. Ireland was partitioned in 1921, and as a result of an uprising against the colonizers, 6 counties were left under the UK, and the rest were constituted as the Republic of Ireland. Yet the 2 states have always maintained some sort of spatial relation. To this day, freedom of movement is regulated by a special legal regime between the 2 states, the Common Travel Act, CTA, established in 1923. Immediately after the establishment of Ireland as a free state, a regime that connects to the history of colonization of the British Empire, but one which grants rights to move freely in both states, and also rights to live, work, and access much social security in both states, including voting rights. This fluid perception of citizenship is at odds with traditional views of the state, and one that could be perhaps studied more to conceive of more modern sort of access to goods and services in the Good Friday Agreement. There is not a simple claim to citizenship in Northern Ireland. There are some people who wish to be identified as belonging to the UK as a nation, the so-called Protestant Unionist Loyalist community, and those who wish instead to be identified as belonging to the Irish state, the Republic in the South, the Catholic Nationalist Republican community. These are already well-versed manifestation of us and them. Further, people can choose what passport they can hold by law. So at the moment, Northern Ireland, there are some people who hold Irish passport and others who hold UK passport and some who hold both. Further, there is increasingly in Northern Ireland a group of people who does not identify with either of these groups. These are accordingly growing in diversity. Northern Ireland, a white country, 93% of the populations, 97% of the population are white, with 3.4% are belonging to another group, whereas 7% are born outside Northern Ireland. Membership is therefore a complex regime in Northern Ireland. So who will be the ones who are banished in this context? Who are the crimigrant others? What practices does the UK embrace here? The assumption is typical of critical criminology that those who are inside the detention center and those are the product of the selection by agencies of social control, the population seen as most problematic. This study is based on the analysis of existing statistics produced by the UK government on immigration detention and short set of interviews conducted with migrant supporters in the UK at the end of the first lockdown in 2020 by myself. Additionally, some freedom of information requests collected in the spring and summer 2021. I am in the process of collecting more qualitative data from key informers, but I'm not yet able to present those findings with you today. So what happens in the UK during the syndemic? First of all, Mary Bosworth, in her analysis on a chapter in an Italian book, talks about the flexibility of the system. In 2020, we know that even the UK eventually joined the regime of lockdown, by which people were confined in their home, in hospitals, or in their places of living, and were limited in their movement. In relation to detention centers, they were, many people were decarcerated. There was a selective process of decarcerations under pressure from legal challenges and from activist pressure. So there was a selective process of decarceration from 1,600 and something people who were in detention at the end of December 2019. We got to 1,700 people at the beginning of June. So there's a massive number of people who were left out. At the same time, though, we have the beginning of the small boat arrivals by the channel, from the channel. And those are mostly people who are placed in detention at this time. In this time, we have also, in conjunction with this event, with this phenomenon, let's say, a reorganization of detention facilities, by which we see the reutilization of barracks and the transformation of some detention center in short-term holding facilities, as well as a hardening of the situation. Asylum seekers are placed in hotels or precarious accommodation. From my study conducted with supporters of volunteers and supporters of migrants in detention, I've gathered that those who were decarcerated and let go were not necessarily in a better situation than if they had been in detention. This is not because I advocate detention, but to say that there's been pure neglect on the side of the state in the release of migrants. So some of them said, one of them said, our initial thought was, yeah, they're going to be released, great, but actually they're more vulnerable now than they were in the center, because they were released very quickly and not necessarily with anywhere secure or safe to go. Another one said, what I've never fully appreciated was, if you live on the fringes of society, you are invisible. To get a GP, to get a bank account in particular in the time of COVID, it seems trivial, but I had no idea. In the shops now, they do not want cash. The person I support does not have a bank account, so can only use cash, which limits the shops to go to. Another one said, we've very quickly realized that we really needed to help people who'd been released to get access to what they needed, whether it was food, clothes, accommodation, signposting to organizations that could help them. It became massive. It became something that was even more important than what we had been doing before, which was generally just emotional support. So we can see from this limited amount of quotes that the process of decarceration was not actually a mode of protecting these people, but was actually compounding on their vulnerability, invisibility, fear, and lack of support. I couldn't add more quotes, but we had people being worried about someone with epilepsy, other people in situation of domestic violence, and generally migrants are not afforded any sort of support on that. So therefore what we had was that small organization, not the big ones, not the big players, took on what we could conceive as biopolitical engagement with these migrants, and took on really the role of providing them with sources of living. Who is not released in the UK in this context? People whose release is judged as dangerous for the public good are not released. People with criminal sentences, in fact, 97% of those who were not released had a criminal sentence, showing again what Mary Bosworth and Cathy Franco have suggested a number of times, the role of this form of detention as a form of extra penalty, a form of penalty beyond the state bordered penalty, they call them. What happens to those who are not released? Interviews with volunteers again suggest that also within the detention centers, anxieties and fears were really high. It's more difficult to make contact with people who are in the center, one says. A number of people who have been granted bail can't be released because their bail address isn't deemed to be acceptable. This was another thing that was noticed a number of times, was that probation officers were not able to release people who would have had the grounds to be released. There is real frustration about things being slower, not being able to get in touch with lawyers to determine whether bail addresses are appropriate. Those inside are afraid of the virus spreading in detention centers, and they are living with a degree of anxiety. They have very little control. There's been a lot of people I've spoken to who've been very, very down and quite suicidal, which ties in with this kind of perpetual waiting, with being in a cycle with bail in principle being granted, then after a couple of weeks, it runs out. So again, we can see here how the sense of abandonment is predominant. There is lack of care, lack of information, lack of support, even in detention. If we look at the general trends, we can see that the COVID-19 syndemic had a big impact, obviously, on the amount of people who were entering detention, given the closure of ports and airports, but that in 2021-22, the numbers have gone up again. So in general, the number of people in detention has decreased since 2015. Which is, if you wish, in contradiction with the idea of the referendum. But we have a critical decrease, obviously, during COVID, and a rise to almost the same number of 2019, with 24,000 people in detention. At the maximum in 2015, we had over 30,000 people in detention. During COVID-19, most entries were from small boats, and they amounted to 1,800 and something people who entered detention. So the general trend is a decrease in effectiveness on the part of the UK state, but also an increase in militarization and harshness for those who are detained. If we look at the type of returns, which is generally what the UK likes to show as being their aim, as we've seen in recent comments, we can see how even in terms of returns, the UK, which used to be at the top of the list of countries effectively doing returns in Europe, going very much down. And forced returns are slightly up, but generally speaking, the only category that is higher is the one by which people are not allowed to enter the state. So there is a change in the mode of bordering, possibly, by which there's a more traditional form of banishment from the land. Rather than passing through the criminal justice system, there seems to be a prevention from people to land and much more use of access to passenger documents before they land, taking advantage, obviously, of the geographical situation. So the COVID-19 highlights the continuum with previous practices. There's a general trend in decrease in detention, containing through port returns, and returns are mostly for foreign national offenders. So showing the continuity with the criminal justice system, but yet a decrease in the functionality of the system overall. Practices of invisibility and abandonment and increased vulnerability for those in detention, in spite of the move to decarcerate a great number of people. Immigration control is thus tightly linked to criminal justice control, and the securitarian logics are underpinning the system, given that those who are not allowed to leave detention during the pandemic are mostly people with criminal sentences. Given this situation, I was reasoning to the fact that it's not adequate to think of migration in general. Northern Ireland does allow this to happen, to look at what's happening in between two countries because of its particular history and situation. But I was thinking that actually, probably more in generally, we should think about migration as an issue that is cross-border, that doesn't belong to one country only, in spite of the fact that, yes, some institution will be peculiar to a country and might be even peculiar in their regional manifestation. So what happens in the Republic of Ireland in terms of migrant detention? There is a new detention place in Dublin Airport, but there is no available data so far on how many people are contained in there. I filed a freedom of information request, but that was rejected. There are also people detained under immigration power in prisons, which was judged as inappropriate. And there are some people, the majority of people are contained in a form of detention that is called direct provision. Those are forms of accommodation organized privately by private contractor, in which people who are waiting for international protection to be granted refugee status are kept. And they are kept effectively in a form of detention because they require authorization to leave. They are provided a sum of money similar to the one provided by the UK, which is 38 euros. Fiona Finn, CEO of a prominent NGO, human rights NGOs on migrants, said in 2020 that there is a lack of transparency around refusal of leave to land at the Irish border, and that there needs to be ways to appeal the decision to prevent landing. If we look at the Eurostat statistic, we can see that there is here an inverse relation to the one that we have in the UK. So in the UK, we have a general decrease of people prevented to entry or in immigration detention since 2013 and much more since 2015. Here we have an increase which spikes up in 2017 and peaks in 2019. The majority of people who are refused entry in Ireland are refused entry by air, so most prominently in airports and possibly in Dublin Airport. What happens in between? What happens between the Republic of Ireland and the UK? There is a strange regime which predates the European Union, which is called the Common Travel Area Agreement, which has or might be a manifestation of the empire that remains in place, which nevertheless affords people, citizens of both the UK and Ireland, to travel freely within the two countries, and they are not subjected to ID controls. So this question, to some extent, the affirmation that Katia Franco makes on the form of immigration, by which it's mostly hard on the outside and soft on the inside, which is not exactly the same in this situation. There are different degrees of outsiderness in the British Empire, and race is a big component. In fact, in this general regime of freedom of movement, the people who are detected by police officers of the two countries are people who appear to be different, mostly people who do not like white. And this resonates much with what El Anani in her book on Bordering Britain suggests is the regime of citizenship, or is the remains of a regime of citizenship that was established with the British Empire, by which initially the empire was happy to extend belonging to everyone who was born in the Commonwealth, and then progressively restricted that that form of belonging to reach only in 1981 the actual form of citizenship as pertaining to the traditional national state. With the Ireland, with Ireland, however, we have still in place this regime by which the Irish can move freely, can work, can leave, can access social security in the UK, and vice versa. So there is a different way of bordering inside and to keep the subordinate position to extract labor. Yes. As I said, there are concerns that the police in both the Garda Síochána and the police service of Northern Ireland mostly select people of color, not necessarily at the border because they couldn't do that because the border is invisible at the moment, but at ports and boarding buses. In fact, there were prominent cases like the lawyer, which you can see there in the image, who was obviously targeted through racial profiling. He was a UK solicitor, just moved to the Northern Ireland because of his partner. And on the other image, you can see a note by a prominent NGO and Deportation Belfast, which collects information from people who suggest they've been targeted, they felt targeted racially on buses because of the color of the skin. So we do have this sort of contestation in Northern Ireland at the moment. But who is in detention? Who ends up in the only detention center in Northern Ireland? This is the police station behind which the Larne detention center is placed. is based in a port in the northern coast, 40 minutes drive from Belfast, in a cul-de-sac street called Hope Street. It's a short-term holding facility. It can hold up to 19 people, so it's a small center, and they can stay for a maximum of 7 days before they can be moved to Scotland or to other places in England to be deported. It is run by a private contractor, Societey, which won a big award in 2017 for the 10 years of services. Its motto is care and custody, so it follows the idea of ethics of care in detention, which Victoria Cunningham suggests is a way of devising the violence of the Home Office. But also this ethics center could be seen as an opening for establishing sorts of alliances with people who are in contact, strict contact with migrants. If we look at the general trend, we can see again how there is a peak in 2015 for that to get a decrease of people in detention and a dramatic decrease, obviously, in 2020. We need to be aware, however, that since 2017, there's been an increased use of the prison system to detain people under immigration power, which in 2021 has actually become the most prominent way of detaining people, at least in Northern Ireland. Through Freedom of Information request, I've gathered some data. One which says that between March 2020 and March 2022, there were 132 people detained under immigration power in prison, and 74 of which were deported. Now you have to bear in mind that the numbers are very limited in Northern Ireland because the region is small. It's 1,900 people at the moment, but used to be 1,500 or 600. Foreign national offenders tend to spend extra time in prison. One person spent over 4 months on top of their sentences, 3 people over 50 days, 1 person over 40 days, and many more over 30 days and over weeks. Now, you might think these are not necessarily very long time, but for a person who's been waiting for long to be released, to not know when they actually get released, maybe to inform their family that they might be released and yet not being able to get out is quite harmful. So this shows the real disregard for people's rights. And also it shows again the ancillary role of the immigration detention in relation to prison, because it seems like there is a double regime for people who are born in other countries or have alternative citizenship, by which there is no longer any proportionality between the crime and the time spent in detention, and there's also the added penalty of deportation. I've analyzed the data from LARN by gender, and I've also wanted to uncover the color line. I've done it in a way that could be contested, and it's definitely not perfect. I use proxies, and I use countries and regions by proxies of race, ethnicity, or color of the skin. The data I have is limited to biological sex. There's no data at the moment for the LGBTQ+ population, so I have to stay with what data I have. So disaggregating the data by gender and by region, you can see here that before 2016, the most prominent group in detention was people coming from Africa. So presumably the great majority having colored skin. From 2016, the time of the referendum onwards, the majority of people in detention the male in detention, were Europeans. So there is a stark change there, signaling that the preoccupation of the institution of social control moved from being focused on racialized population to being focused on the Eastern European population. If we disaggregate the data further, we can see how the majority of people in of the Eastern Europeans, of the European ones, are Eastern Europeans, which probably is said before without realizing. And if we look at the female population instead, the picture is slightly different. So it is worth disaggregating the data by gender. Again, up to 2016, the African populations are the most likely to be in detention in LARN. After 2016, the Asian population are the most likely to be in detention in LARN. During the pandemic, what we can see is that the South Americans are the most prominent, but the only group actually growing in detention are the Europeans. So there is a slight change compared to what happens for the male population. If we disaggregate the data further, in the Asian population, which is the most prominent group in detention in LARN after the Brexit referendum, the majority of these women were from China. China is the second most prominent group in Northern Ireland by population, so it might be perhaps not so surprising. If we look at the nationalities, and again we look at very small numbers, we can see how the majority of the male detained in LARN were from Romania, and the others most prominently were from Eastern European, apart from Brazil and Pakistan, who have a racialized population of them. The top female nationalities again show Romania as the top, again confirming that during the COVID-19 syndemic, the focus was on Eastern Europeans, but the rest were all racialized populations. So if we look back at what Katia Franco had said about the criminalization processes in this context, she says criminalization is directed at the sanctioning inequality as a moral issue, transforming issue of poverty and moral and social exclusion in an issue of good and bad on the basis of citizenship. So the focus now during COVID-19 and also after 2016 for male population is mostly on the Romanian population, which happens to be the country most at risk of poverty or social exclusion, according to the Eurostat statistic. So the criminalization here, we have to remember that Romanians were allowed to get in the country and in Northern Ireland as well since 2007, and many of them, over 3,000, arrive and pick up cheap jobs in meat factories and in the agricultural fields, and they have become now deportable, despite the fact that they had been able to be part of Northern Ireland in the workforce. So we could think about what is happening there. So to recap, before Brexit, we can see in terms of patterns of criminalization in Northern Ireland, before Brexit, we can see that the relevance was that of the color of the skin. Male and female from Africa were mostly detained in LARN. After Brexit, we have some changes. The relevance of gender, certainly, because there's a change between male and female population, and the relevance of geopolitics for the male population, but of skin color for female population. Again, here we could think about why that is, And possibly we can think about the idea of the color of the nation, and the female body might be threatening in that way. During COVID-19, we see the relevance of geopolitics. So the Brexit referendum plays a huge role. The UK is here likely to direct the game, by which they are positioning themselves as outside Europe, but also positioning themselves very much in the western side of the global north countries. The main nationality here is constituted by Romanians, both male and females, possibly the majority foreign national offenders, because those are the ones who are mostly deported due to the lack of travel, are kept in detention at this time. So as Katia Franco argues, the crimigrant other in Northern Ireland is influenced by geopolitical position. It signals a break with the EU and the Eastern Europe in particular. For females, it shows relevance of colors and again of the eastern part of the world. Yet the banishment might no longer be primarily linked to criminal justice, but more traditional forms of bordering, by which the banishment happens at the border before people are allowed to enter. So tentative final remarks. What we've seen with the coming of the syndemic in March 2020 and then Brexit with January 2021 is a harsher treatment of migrants in detention. There is an enhanced role of the prison in the system, both first detention and extra detention as added to the sentence. There's a decreased level of support, both legal and in terms of welfare. The relevance of geopolitics, the East-West distinction within the youth context plays a role here. The focus is on Romanians as the crimigrant others, who are produced as the border of the nation, linked to issues of moral worth. They are looked at as bad. Their citizenship renders them alien within this part of the world. And an issue of global inequality is here translated into a moral issue. There are also emergence of forms of banishment, more traditional, like the increase in returns import returns. There is a relevance of gender, which we need to notice. The female bodies of color is more problematic than others. The legacy of the empire, in which whiteness is seen as belonging, and there are different degrees of outsiderness. And also we need to look at the cross-border element of the analysis. Migration can be looked at in relation to different countries of mobility rather than look at just the institution of one state. To contest this kind of practices of indifference and abandonment by the state, I argue we should point to the many practices of care that have emerged during COVID-19. This is a case of promiscuous care, a form of care that goes and that establishes kinship beyond the family and the nation, which are traditionally and institutionally supported. I read you this quotation because I like it very much. I asked the taxi driver, this is in Northern Ireland, I asked the taxi driver, would he deliver the 21 men a little box, just a little mushroom box full of nice fruit and vegetables on a Monday, and I would pay for them. And he said he didn't want any money because he wasn't working much at the moment. But the nice thing that I think is wonderful is that when I rang him after the first month to ask him to do the second month, because the young men love to get these little boxes, you know, with a pepper and an aubergine and, you know, fresh herbs and an apple and an orange and 2 bananas, you know, they love that. So what has happened? This taxi man has got friends with some of the boys, and his wife has made banana bread for them, and our neighbors have baked stuff too. So when the virus is over, 2 of the boys are going to go and show his wife how to bake something from their country. This is an area where that would have never happened. I rang him and I said, would you do another month? He said, oh, no problem. He said, I've got friendly with them now. He said, do you know one of those men's been to university? And I said to him, oh yeah, And you know, another one is a doctor, is waiting to become a doctor in this country. You know, that for me is really good. So that's what I see as an example of promiscuous care, drawing from the Care Manifesto that was published in 2020, a care that goes beyond the care for the fellow citizen. It is also a form of care that is sometimes devalued in neoliberal societies. It is left to charities and volunteers groups to provide for this kind of care. Care is an ability which is both of the individual and of the collective. It is about creating material forms of connectivity so that the majority of creatures can thrive. This is about recognizing interdependence beyond the boundaries that the nation state sanction on people's body, the extension of intimate relationship, the creation of kinship beyond the family. The care we talk about here is not the instrumentalization of care that we can see exploited by the private contractor operating detention centers. This form of sociality and the practices that make this possible provide space for different forms of living to emerge, different forms of living that disturb current biopolitical formations. This is about challenging the pockets of abandonment and differential belonging, the unequal distribution of harm and hope, the cloaking of the child in the broom closet, as Pominelli says. These practices of relationality that create and are shaped by a sense of connectivity enable the intensification of our social relations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Teresa. That was extremely interesting, really fascinating. We are